Eastern Canada's Via Rail network has declined significantly over the last 40 years, reflecting the reduction of passenger rail in the region. Since the takeover of passenger services from Canadian National and Canadian Pacific in 1978, the network has been reduced dramatically, with only a single route remaining. Connecting various smaller towns and outlying communities with regional centres, this network was a crucial lifeline for Eastern Canada and faced declines due to government cutbacks and railway track abandonments. But how did the network change from the daily routes of 1978 to the single line that remains today? I'm Zach with Vanishy Underground, and let's take a look. Via service in Eastern Canada began in April 1978, when Via took over Canadian National's passenger trains, forming the original network of service in Eastern Canada. This consisted of a twice-daily train running between Montreal, Quebec and Halifax, Nova Scotia, servicing stops in Lévis, Quebec and other smaller towns. A once-daily train also ran between Montreal, Quebec and Gaspé, Quebec, servicing many of the same stops. Once-daily services also ran between Quebec City and Edmundston, New Brunswick, as well as between Edmundston and Moncton, New Brunswick. A twice-daily train in New Brunswick also linked the province's two biggest cities of Moncton and Saint John. In Nova Scotia, twice-daily services ran from Halifax to Sydney, servicing intermediate stops in various small towns. In October 1978, Via acquired additional services from Canadian Pacific. These included a new route in Nova Scotia between Halifax and Yarmouth, as well as services between Montreal, Quebec and Saint John, New Brunswick, running through Sherbrooke, Quebec and the U.S. state of Maine. Via began making changes to the CN and CP networks in 1979, discontinuing daily service between Edmundston, New Brunswick and Quebec City in July. In October, more major changes were made, streamlining services and changing trains to operate on tracks owned by both companies. In southern Quebec, trains between Saint John and Montreal through Sherbrooke were revised, with Via trains no longer servicing Magog, Farnham, and Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu. These trains were rerouted through Saint-Hyacinthe, as well as being extended from Saint John to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Trains running between Gaspé and Montreal, Quebec were cut back to Matapédia, while service between Montreal and Mont-Joli was replaced by a separate service. Trains between Montreal and Halifax running through Lévis, Quebec were reduced to once daily, with a second train added between Moncton and Campbellton, New Brunswick to maintain service levels. Trains between Saint John and Moncton were reduced to run once daily and extended to Halifax at the same time. In June 1980, frequency on trains running between Halifax and Kentville, Nova Scotia were reduced to a single daily trip, which ran the length of the line to Yarmouth. 1981 saw the first round of budget cuts for Via, with a 20% cut in service affecting various routes. In November, daily service in New Brunswick between Moncton and Edmundston was discontinued. At the same time, service between Halifax and Montreal running through the United States and Sherbrooke, Quebec was cancelled. In its place, however, daily service running between Halifax and Saint John, New Brunswick was extended to Fredericton, bringing passenger rail to the provincial capital. In May 1983, service in Quebec was further revised. The train running between Montreal and Mont-Joli was discontinued, being replaced once again by the Gaspé to Matapédia train being extended back to Montreal. June 1984 saw service change in Nova Scotia, with one of the two daily trips between Sydney and Halifax being cut back to Port Hawkesbury. In October of that year, service in New Brunswick between Moncton and Edmundston was also restarted, running 3 times per week. 1985 saw further service restorations, with various changes taking place in June. Trains between Montreal and Halifax running through the United States and Sherbrooke, Quebec were restarted on a once-daily frequency. With this change, trains between Montreal and Halifax through Lévis, Quebec were cut back to Moncton, with passengers traveling to Halifax being required to transfer. Also in June, service was introduced between Quebec City and Mont-Joli on a daily frequency. In New Brunswick, service between Fredericton and Halifax was also once again cut back to Saint John in September of that year, maintaining its once daily frequency. In October 1986, service between Halifax and St. John was split in Moncton, with services between Moncton and Halifax reduced to 6 days a week. However, this arrangement was further revised in November 1987, with daily through service between Halifax and St. John's resuming only in the eastbound direction. A small change was made in Nova Scotia in April 1989, with train service between Halifax and Port Hawkesbury being reduced to once daily, in line with the rest of the route. January 1990 saw a 50% cut in VIA passenger service, which decimated many of the remaining routes in eastern Canada. In Nova Scotia, service between Halifax and Yarmouth, as well as Halifax and Sydney, was completely cancelled, removing train service from Digby, Kentville, and Port Hawkesbury. New Brunswick saw train service to Edmundston cancelled, as well as regional trains between Campbellton and Moncton, as well as St. John and Halifax removed. Quebec saw the cancellation of trains between Quebec City and Mont-Joli. The 3 remaining lines saw their frequencies reduced to run only 3 days per week. However, lines were scheduled to provide alternating service 6 days per week between Halifax and Moncton, as well as Matapedia and Montréal. At the end of 1994, service between Montreal and Halifax through the United States and Sherbrooke, Quebec was discontinued due to the track owners applying to abandon the route. In its place, however, service on the Montreal to Halifax train through Lévis was boosted to run 6 days per week, maintaining service frequency between these 2 points. The following year in 1995, trains running between Montreal and Gaspé were changed to join with the Halifax to Montreal trains in Matapedia. VIA introduced a once-weekly tourist train running in Nova Scotia in 2000. Running between Halifax and Sydney, the line was advertised as a rail cruise, completing the journey to Sydney on Tuesdays and returning to Halifax on Wednesdays during the summer and fall. This train was in operation until 2004, when it was discontinued. Another round of budget cuts occurred in 2012, reducing service between Montreal and Halifax to 3 days per week. The following year, track conditions forced VIA to end trains between Gaspé and Montreal, leaving only one route operating in eastern Canada. Finally, in 2014, Halifax to Montreal trains were changed to operate into the Quebec City area, no longer servicing the station in Lévis. This brings us to the VIA Rail map of eastern Canada that we know today. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new about how the VIA Rail network in eastern Canada came to be. If you have any questions or we got anything wrong, please leave us a comment down below. You can also check out our videos on the complete evolution of the VIA Rail network by clicking on the button in the top right corner of this video. As always, feel free to leave a like if you want to see more. And as for us here, we'll be vanishing underground until the next one.